How do you take one of the most recognizable brands in gaming, the flagship title and basically mascot of one of the major consoles, and change the design of one of the most well-known single-player games to now be a completely different genre, open world? That's what we're going to discuss in this video as we break down the design of Halo Infinite. We're going to break down the design changes into 3 key factors: how to handle the player, how to handle progress versus power, and how to handle the content structure across the experience. But let's start by looking a little bit at the Halo franchise first. Halo is no stranger to change. The series has regularly cut new ground for itself to keep ideas fresh and new. This is the series that said, what if we made an RTS that was purpose-built for controller? Absolute mad scientist play, but Halo Wars was bloody excellent. Jump online and mass warthog Gauss cannon rush someone into submission. Man, those are good memories. They went for a foray into world building with Reach and ODST, looking at the world from a first-person perspective that didn't belong to Master Chief. They did some narrative flip-flopping back and forth in Halo 5, not revolutionary, but still a change up of the mainline formula. I know a lot of people didn't vibe this one, but I actually really enjoyed it. But with the release of Halo Infinite, we see the biggest switch up to date in the gameplay formula of a mainline Halo game. And you can tell me whether you think the biggest switch up is the entire open world that they've changed the game to be, or this one little grapple hook. The addition of the open world is not a simple feat for the design and the structure of a Halo game. It presents many challenges that come with going from a scripted, linear single-player encounter design to the kind of freedom that is both afforded to and valued by a player of an open-world game. So let's dig into that design philosophy, how it clashes with the standard linear design, and what changes were made so Halo could address some of these issues. If you enjoy this breakdown at any time, feel free to hit the like button. Let's first address some of the differences between open world and linear design. Some of the main ones at least. In a single player game, the designer can take a really good guess at just about everything to do with the player when they are designing an encounter. They can guess what weapons they might have. They know how far along in any progression trees the player might be. They know what abilities are unlocked and how long they have been unlocked for. They can basically make a really good estimation at everything. It's not always perfect because players always find crazy ways to make things complicated. When I was younger playing Halo, I would often find something like a rocket launcher and just carry it with me through a massive amount of the level, just to make sure that I had it if I needed it. But if there was ever 2 hunters sprung on me, well, they had better watch out. But for the most part, you just need to stick to the bell curve to aim your design in the right direction. In an open world game, part of the grand fantasy is that you can go wherever and do whatever. This presents a problem where the designer now has almost no idea about the player. Are they fresh out of the tutorial, or are they fully kitted out with endgame gear and hours of experience? What weapons will they have? Will they be bringing a posse of NPCs, or are they all on their lonesome? Following on from this, in a similar fashion, is the linear design has a good idea about where the player might be and has complete control of how much freedom they want to give the player, down to the level of the player will walk through this exact door, and thus I can script something to happen as soon as they do. It's where these cheeky suicide grunt bastards come in. If the designer wants to be a little bit more loose, they can widen the space up a bit and let the player approach it from a few different ways. There's an example in one of the previous games where if you rush out of a door quick enough, you can pilot a Banshee, but otherwise you'll need to fight your way through the area with guns while that Banshee attacks you. There's also the second mission of the first Halo game where you have to help Marines defend these towers that they're located at, but you can kind of do that however you want to do it. When it comes to open world design, the open world designer has no idea where the player will be coming from, or to the first point, what they will be bringing. If the player is in the late game, they might have access to movement and traversal abilities that allow them to come from just about any direction. One cannot rely on the player approaching from a specific direction or being in a certain place to allow for scripted events. You can't even rely on the player starting or finishing something that they come across. They might just skip it and keep moving with the intention of coming back later, or maybe never complete the content at all. And you can see how this is kind of shaping our 3 questions from the start. How to handle the player, how to handle power versus progression, and how to handle the content structure across the experience. So let's switch gears for a second and pull apart what's actually changed in Halo Infinite. Changes. Chief now has a range of equipment that can be unlocked. Each of these pieces of equipment also have a series of upgrades, making them stronger, more useful, but also increasing the possible loadout variations that a designer needs to consider. So the first thing that is a massive change in Halo Infinite is the hookshot. The hookshot drastically improves Master Chief's mobility. This hook can be shot out and attached to just about anything really, and it will pull Chief along towards that location in a straight line. And it can even be attached to things like enemies. This gives Master Chief a ton more options in terms of getting around the room, getting up on features that you might not normally be able to get up on, quickly moving across distances or repositioning. You can't rely on Master Chief now having to make his way on foot from one location to another. The hookshot also allows access to other new features. It can be used to hook weapons. If the enemies drop a gun, or if guns are located on a weapon rack, Chief can, from behind cover even, use the hook to bring a weapon towards him. This allows a little bit more diversity in your loadout, but also means that Chief won't be exposing himself as much. You can transition into driving from grappling, so you can close the distance from cover to a vehicle very quickly and instantly pilot into it without needing to worry about maneuvering around to the driver's seat. This gives Chief a ton more mobility and safety in terms of moving towards vehicles. The grapple hook, once upgraded, adds a stun ability. Once you hit an enemy with the grapple hook, it will stun them for a number of seconds. This can be used on high value targets like elites or brutes to immobilize them, or it can be used to incapacitate smaller enemies. This adds a lot of power in terms of controlling the flow of the battles, because you can completely remove a certain enemy from the fight at any point. Further down the progression tree for the grapple hook is a special melee ability, once again adding another power dynamic. It's a strong melee attack that occurs at the point where Chief has locked on. This can even be done without hooking an enemy, and it has an area of effect around it. And another one that seems like a small fix but is actually a pretty big consideration is that the grapple hook can knock away Jackal's shields. Shooting it once into a Jackal's shield will cause them to stumble backwards and they will lose their shield guard. It also doesn't consume the grapple hook's charge because the grapple hook is on a cooldown based system. So a player is able to knock away a Jackal's shield, then instantly grapple towards that Jackal in order to close the distance, where previously Jackals were very dangerous because it was a matter of having to get around the shield. Now, if you can get close enough to grapple hook them, they can be taken down much easier. There is also a range of other equipment that has been added to the game. This is kind of less important because these pieces of equipment aren't as involved as the grapple hook clearly has been designed to be, but they include a threat sensor that can be used to locate enemy positions. It will ping outwards in the spherical motion, revealing enemies at intervals in red so that you can locate their positions. It can also be upgraded further to continuously show the positions of enemies. Chief has access to a bubble shield, which can be deployed and then fired through by Chief while mitigating fire from the front. And there's also a thruster that Chief gets access to, which functions kind of like a dodge roll, allowing him to cover distance quickly by boosting essentially. Continuing on with our list of changes to Halo Infinite is the access to different kinds of areas. The world itself is broken up into all of these different little sections where events happen. This is very different from the linear design of the previous Halo games, where events would happen in a scripted linear fashion. Now events can happen in any order, and many different kinds of events can happen or not happen depending on how the player engages with the content. The grapple hook also changes up the access that the player has, allowing them to reach things like high ledges, mountain sides, giving them much more freedom and options in terms of the approach that they use to come at a combat encounter. And the player also has access to more options. Halo Infinite sees the addition of these different kinds of barrels strewn all around the world You'll see these in just about every combat encounter, and they're excellent. They can be picked up and thrown, and they explode on impact with a range of different secondary effects. They are super fun and super useful for doing massive damage or crowd control within an encounter. And similar to the weapon racks that we spoke about before, they can also be hooked with the hook shot, allowing the player to quickly receive high damaging barrels that they can then throw at the enemy, making controlling an encounter significantly easier. You will do this all the time playing Halo. These barrels are everywhere. Continuing on with other options you're afforded, naturally being an open world, you have access to different kinds of weapons. You can take a weapon from any part of the open world that you collect and take it to any other part of the open world. So in a linear game, you would obviously be afforded certain weapons that are available within the mission, and then you are probably restricted somewhat by the amount of ammo that you're provided for those weapons. In Halo Infinite, you can take whatever weapon from wherever you want and bring it to just about wherever you want. So the designer has no idea what weapons the player is going to have. On top of this, Halo Infinite has this system for forward operating bases. These are little areas that you can capture within the map, which then give you access to these platforms that allow you to spawn a range of things. To that point, you are able to pick different weapons that will be fabricated on the spot, allowing you access to just about any weapon in the game whenever you want to take wherever you want. These are restricted somewhat by a system in the game called Valor, which is essentially the more open world side content you do, the wider access to the UNSC arsenal you'll have. But along with this also comes bring your own vehicles. On the forward operating bases, vehicles can be spawned and they're brought in from the Pelican that is piloted by one of the story characters. Access to these vehicles is also restricted by the amount of Valor that you have earned, but essentially, if you wanted to, you could get access to whatever vehicle you want. Finally, Halo Infinite has a robust AI system driving the UNSC Marines that are found all around the ring. These Marines also spawn at forward operating bases. You could spawn in at a forward operating base, choose whatever weapons you want, choose whatever vehicle you want, and choose how many or which particular weapons your posse of NPCs will have, and then you could roll out to any encounter. This obviously is the wild west of game design. So let's go back and look at our 3 questions. How to handle the player. The grapple hook is a massive one here. The player needs to be controlled, restricted, because they have such crazy mobility that's been given to them through the addition of the grapple hook. It's also powering up the player by giving them options, allowing them to get weapons or allowing them to grab barrels from behind cover or easily pilot vehicles. And the access to options is making it difficult to handle the player because they can have any weapons and any vehicle and any number of NPCs come with them at any point. In terms of power versus progression, we have a range of different equipment that is acquired throughout the game, so it's difficult to tell what a player will have at any one point. Each of these pieces of equipment make Chief stronger, so he's going to have a different level of power depending on how much of this stuff he's unlocked, as well as a different level of information and a different level of mobility. In particular here, the deployable shield is quite equalizing because it can be deployed to completely reduce damage from a particular direction. And the most useful that I found was the threat sensor, because you can be completely aware where the enemies are at any one point by deploying threat sensors. And if we look at the structure of the content, we have things like the hookshot affecting the jackals. We now can't strew them around in the same way because they can just be easily dispatched by using a hookshot to break their shield defense. We need to consider the amount of valor that the player has in order to structure out content that can be accessed appropriately based on what weapons that they have access to and what vehicles they might have access to. And we need to design encounters around the idea that they may have all of this stuff or none of this stuff and be coming back from the end of the game. There also can't be an encounter that is designed for a piece of gear that the player might not have yet. The encounters also need to support the idea that Chief may have several NPCs with him, so the AI needs to be robust enough to be able to engage in this encounter without getting held up by not being able to navigate around the play space. So these are some of the problems that obviously would have came up for Halo Infinite, transitioning from a linear design to an open world design. Now, let's have a look at how they responded to some of these problems and the design solutions that they came up with to fix them. Responding to changes. The best way to probably approach this is to get the structure of the content out of the road first, so let's dig into the structure of the content from a macro standpoint. How has the structure changed from mission list to open world? This first one is going to immediately sound like I'm messing with you and wasting your time, but bear with me, I swear I'm not. Halo uses a lot of tried and true open world design in its transition from linear play, including one quite common design decision to handle story content. Just ignore the open world for the story. Almost all the missions in Halo Infinite are linear internal spaces, basically what Halo used to be. They are also sectioned off areas, more than not, where the player actually loads into a different area to play the missions. This is obviously very good for handling the 3 questions that we spoke about before, because the designer now has control over the space again. But I think it does miss a decent opportunity to change up the formula in a Halo game. I can understand not wanting to stray too far from Halo's DNA and therefore keeping the Halo missions strictly linear. Hopefully when the sequel to this game comes out, there will be an opportunity to expand the mission structures. Now, depending on what you consider a mission, you might feel that I'm being a little bit unfair here when I say that all of the missions are in enclosed spaces. There are a couple of play spaces that are set in the open world and take advantage of some of its aspects. There is a mission early in the game where you need to attack a tower, and to get in, you need to turn on a grav lift. This can be approached however you like, which is nice. Your approach is essentially up to you. Bring whatever weapons, vehicles, and NPCs you want. You can approach from the back or the front. You can use your hookshot or run straight in through the front gate. There is another mission where you need to destroy a series of structures, and you can do that in any order, but you are locked into that area until you get it done, so you can't bring the whole open world to bear on that task. The most, in quotes, open world the game gets is one section of the game opens up a large part of the map and asks you to clear a number of towers to continue. You can do these in any order, and you can bring whatever weapons and vehicles and NPCs you want to approach them basically however you like. They're sectioned quite a distance from each other, and there is tons of side content that opens up at the same time, so you can kind of pick and choose when and how you want to approach these towers. The towers themselves, though, aren't exactly massive installations. They're just small outposts of banished troops, and then once you've done those 4, you are funneled straight back into another linear mission. For the most part, this actually basically lands us back where we were before. For the story missions, just pretend the open world doesn't exist. Now, this is actually a pretty common solution for single-player games that are set in open worlds these days. To deliver the story content, we just transition back to a linear design mindset, and there's nothing wrong with that. Lots of games have a semi-open world feel that works for them, so I'm not throwing shade at Halo here. But we still have a series of progression systems and other things to manage that will be brought into the linear mission design of the story missions. So let's continue and talk about what's left over once we take out the linear story missions, the open world part of the game. What's actually in there? Well, the open world houses all of the side content, so let's talk a little bit about that. This video is focusing on the design side of things, so we won't go super into depth about what every little thing in the open world actually is. The open world in Halo follows a fairly standard design principles approach to handling the content progression from start to finish. The first thing that is done is sectioning out the world into chunks, which gradually become available as the player progresses through the game. Each chunk has locations for the story missions and a range of side content activities available that are littered throughout the open world. The player is usually free to pick and choose what they want to do out of this side content, and they can come back to do it later if desired. This helps manage this progression of content, as it allows content to be gradually introduced to the player. It allows the design of encounters that match the power level of the player across the experience. Easier encounters, or encounters that rely on less unlockable content at the start. As more abilities are unlocked, unlock more of the map, and introduce harder content. Similarly, to handle the player's progression, we also have the Valor system and Spartan cores. Valor is the system we spoke about earlier, which determines the availability of equipment and vehicles at the forward operating bases. The more Valor you have, the more you will be able to unlock and choose from next time you are at an FOB. By tying progression to a standard currency like this, it decouples the progression from the world and the specific events therein. Players are able to engage with whatever content they want to, at whatever level they are comfortable with, and be rewarded accordingly. If you want the best gear, you will need to do a lot of the side content. But if you want to mainline the story, you may need to just deal with what you have. As a sidebar, there is actually an example of the opposite in Halo Infinite 2. One of the open world events is tracking down and killing high value banished targets. Each one of these targets has a particular variant of a weapon in the game, and when Chief kills them, he gets access to that weapon at the FOBs for fabrication. You can see how this contrasts with the Valor system. Here, you need to do a specific task in order to get the reward, where the Valor system promotes engaging with the system more broadly in whatever way you want, and working up to a reward by doing whatever content interests you. There are also Spartan cores. These are strewn around the map in crates. Chief uses multiples of these to upgrade his shield and equipment, gaining him access to more useful features and routing out his combat ability. By sectioning out the world, the designers can tune the amount of progression the player will get access to simply by having more or less side content available. This also allows the designers to control the max and min range. The more they add, the further along the progression trees the player can actually progress. They then are able to try to maintain an appropriate lower end of the progression by allocating Valor for storyline missions and placing Spartan cores in the storyline missions to hopefully prevent any players from getting too underpowered in a playthrough that is more main story focused. So that's some of the ways that the general structure of the content is helping to address our questions, which just leaves one more area: the minute-to-minute gameplay. Let's look at the response to the change from linear to open world design at a more granular level. The first one is that the enemy density in any particular area is sometimes hidden, or you could say it's staged. You may come across an event in the open world. You might see a few brutes attacking a few peeps. So you go over. Many times what will then happen is it will start the engagement, and the engagement will progress to multiple levels of reinforcements. Once you have dispatched the first group, a phantom carrying reinforcements will often come to drop off more troops. There are also these drop pods that spawn that then brutes or other enemies will jump out of, allowing for a more specific insertion of troops into an area. And this gives the designers an opportunity to both not give away their hand and change up the battlefield by surprising the player with more enemies. I'm not sure if this actually happens, but delivering reinforcements in this staggered pattern, allowing them to be dropped off after the encounter starts, would also allow the difficulty to be scaled by dropping off more high-level endgame enemies against a player that has finished the campaign or has a lot of upgrades. Dropping them off in this fashion allows the difficulty of each encounter to be tuned to the power of the current player, and this will somewhat mitigate the difference between the power and the progression. In the same way that the Marines have a robust AI, the enemies have a complex and robust AI to try to match some of this power that the player has gained moving open world. The enemy may throw barrels at the player in the same way that the player can throw barrels at the enemy. This means that the barrels are a double-edged sword. They're strewn around everywhere for the player to use, but the enemy can also get access to these high damaging items. The brutes sometimes will pick up and throw suicide grunts at you, throwing a spanner in the works that is an exploding grunt moving quickly across the battlefield. Enemies are also smart enough to shoot barrels while Chief is carrying them. This pushes Chief to consider keeping a barrel versus throwing it at an enemy rather than waiting for it to be the perfect opportunity to be able to drop a barrel on somebody. Jackals still suck, but as we mentioned before, we can't position them in the same way that we used to. So jackals are often positioned in high vantage points around encounters, but significantly further away than they might have been in previous games. This makes getting to them and dispatching each individual jackal difficult to do, which means being able to rush around and quickly take out lots of the long range capability needs to be considered, because other jackals will get shots off while you're dispatching one of their friends, not to mention the fire that you'll be taking from the main encounter group. Enemies are also at least what seems to me, way more accurate than they have been in previous games. The AI has been tuned to be much more capable of predicting where the chief is and therefore countering the chief's actions. Legendary is still super painful, it always has been. Even normal will present a pretty decent challenge to the average player, and they will need to think about the way that they approach things rather than just roll in and crush everything in their path because they're playing on an easier difficulty. The AI is significantly more accurate, or at least seem to be. You are forced to cover more often, you're forced to recover your shield more often. But what I think is probably the biggest change and the thing that makes the biggest difference in this game is the addition of a few particular weapons. And they are the Ravager, the Skewer, and the Scrap Cannon. All of these weapons add a long-range arcing projectile to the mix of things that the player will need to deal with. The Ravager also has this burning plasma effect that will deal progressive damage in an area where the projectile lands, and this can sometimes flush Chief out of cover by making the ground underneath him damaging. The range is also significant. We have access through the grapple hook to many more areas than you might normally have access to in a Halo game. But these long-range projectiles mean that you can be pinned down in just about any place around a combat encounter. While you may have some benefit being high on a cliffside, for example, with a sniper rifle, enemies with these weapons will be able to shoot you. They will be able to reach you. And so the advantage that is gained by positioning yourself in such a way that's provided by the open world is somewhat mitigated by the accuracy of these enemies and the addition of these weapons that can be used to mitigate some of the Chief's lethality. And this is an open world, you have access to different options in terms of the vehicles and things, but these weapons also deal high damage. They are functional at dispatching vehicles. They will kill the Marines that you bring to a fight easily. And you may even be thinking, well, that's all good. Later in the game, I'll get access to flying vehicles. Well, that's not the case either. They're long-range, arcing weapons that do a lot of damage against vehicles, and combined with the enemy accuracy that we just discussed, they are capable and even threatening anti-air weapons. So it becomes much more difficult to just fly in and kill enemies with either a Banshee or the new UNSC edition, the Wasp. So hopefully through this deconstruction of Halo Infinite, you've been able to see the massive task that 343 Industries had on their hands, taking Halo from a linear game to an open world one. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop it a like, and the subscribe button is right there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.